Good afternoon. My name is Cynthia Cabañas, and I'm a PhD candidate at the CineLab at Birbeck University of London under the supervision of Tim Smith and Atsushi Senju. Thank you for attending my talk, where I present a brief overview of my PhD project entitled Dramatic Irony, Spontaneous Theory of Mind, and the Moment-to-Moment Processing of Film Events. I will be presenting the general framework rather than focusing on presenting many results, as you will see. Many of you will be familiar with this classical task, the salient task, and its different versions, commonly used to measure the understanding of false belief in others, which can be considered a limit case in theory of mind computation, and therefore very insightful for research. However, there are some methodological limitations in this traditional approach, including the abstraction of stimuli and too much signposting that can contrast with real-life theory of mind. For this reason, researchers started to use films as naturalistic stimuli, since they involve complex multimodal information and they are dynamic and contextually embedded. So one example is the mask or movie assessment of social cognition. In these tasks, it is assumed that individuals spontaneously engage in theory of mind reasoning during these scenarios. However, there is a challenge to test this assumption, since these tasks typically instruct participants explicitly to mentalize. So how can we combine the strengths of both approaches to understand spontaneous and not only explicit theory of mind processes in a controlled but ecologically valid way? So I propose that we may have participants watch films which exploit our theory of mind abilities in a systematic way, where we need to consider what characters know to understand the scene. So for instance, to understand the scene from City Lights, we need to consider the broader context that this woman who is blind believes Charlie Chaplin is a rich man, whereas we, the audience, know that he's a tramp. This is a canonical example of dramatic irony, which is a narrative device where the audience knows something that at least one of the characters doesn't. So the use of dramatic irony often follows a three-act structure. There is an establisher scene that sets up the situation. In this case, we see a publisher rejecting Harold Lloyd's manuscript and telling him that he will receive a rejection letter in the mail, something that we might be familiar with as academics. In the installation scene, which provides crucial information that one or more characters are not aware of, the audience can see how when Harold has left, the publisher changes his mind and asks his assistant to send Harold a check instead of a rejection slip. Finally, in the exploitation scenes, we see the misunderstandings that are a consequence of the ignorance of the character. So in this example, when Harold receives the letter, he tears it apart without opening it, since he thinks it's the rejection slip. So this structure is particularly useful for investigating spontaneous theory of mind, since it naturally prompts the audience to make inferences about the character's epistemic and states and false beliefs, mirroring the structure of the classical salient task. So we showed a group of participants 6 of these clips, and for a control group, we edited out the installation. So some participants don't watch the installation, and in this version, sorry for the noise, viewers should infer that Harold indeed received the rejection slip. So this allowed us to compare whether viewers process the same, this allowed us to compare whether viewers process the same exploitation scenes differently depending on their false beliefs or true belief representation of the characters. So this kind of paradigm allows us to explore research questions related to how these different cognitive processes may interact in dramatic irony processing, so including event comprehension, attention, working memory, and spontaneous theory of mind. To address these questions, we use a multi-level examination approach. So we have participants watch the clips while we track their eye movements, and then we ask them to describe in a paragraph what happened in the previous clip and why. So from these descriptions, we can code whether they understood the dramatic irony and their spontaneous use of mental state references. Some parts of the clips are presented as a slideshow, or what is called self-paced viewing paradigm, and we ask viewers to press a button to progress from frame to frame, controlling their own viewing times. And we take that as proxy for how long they take to process the information. So finally, we also are currently looking at dramatic irony structures through the lens of naturalistic fMRI approaches, now with the help of Dr. Gal Raz in Tel Aviv, where I'm at this moment. Even though I don't have time to show you results, you can see from the heat maps that we have ways to characterize the spatiotemporal distribution of attention with eye trackers in false belief attribution versus true beliefs. In the heat maps, we can see how when participants infer false beliefs, they look longer at the letter in red than when they infer true beliefs in blue. So in these other clips, we can also see that no matter which emotion Harold was portraying, participants who inferred that Harold had a false belief would look significantly longer more to the mouth than to the eye region. So in conclusion, I didn't have time, but I hope I managed to give you a glimpse of how we may use dramatic irony sequences in film as a naturalistic test of viewers' complex spontaneous theory of mind processing, and that it has the potential to allow us to characterize behavioral and attentional patterns in the cognitive processing of false beliefs, both in terms of individual differences and maybe potentially as an early and often a typical marker for familial behavioral variant of frontotemporal dementia, which is a project that we are doing right now in collaboration with Dr. ten Brink. So thank you very much for your attention. And if you're interested, we published the paper on the general framework as well.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. That was amazing. And I mean, I always think people have a bit of a head start if they have a topic that is easier to get into. I pity people who work with cells and things that are trickier to explain. But you also, I think, just to give some positive feedback, you were really good at helping us understand it, either because we knew the salient task or because we've watched those movies go, he's behind the door, you know. And I think maybe something like that could also help you. We talked about it in the last fishbowl session. You know, you could play on that little, you know, that gag that we all know about, you know, that there's somebody scary behind the door, or and I think that you have that with your topic. It's so easily accessible. So that was one point. And maybe in some of the slides there's a lot of dead space. And I think that there's a balance we all have to find. I certainly haven't found it yet. You know, just finding the optimal use of the space on your slide. I think as an artist, you know, they're super good at understanding. I went to a museum and you have a Rembrandt portrait and he's got this like super poignant face set in the middle of nothing, and it's okay, you're totally cool with it because of the way he's done it. But you know, sometimes when there's that dead space and it's not used in such a way that it just, so that was a little bit of feedback, because the science is beautiful, the way you got us into it was great. I think maybe slide usage is something, and I think that it's something we can all, and we haven't heard very much about it today. I think we've had lots of positive feedback that most of the slides are just unbelievable. I think if I think back to my slides when I was starting out, I cringe. I've looked at them actually and did cringe. The level of slides today has just been amazing, and yours are just as good. So that was really the only comment I had. I don't know what Karina has to say.
So yeah, is it mainly, so yeah, I'll give you some feedback, but I thought it was really, really interesting. And I love to also hear your results. So I like to also maybe ask you a little bit about that if there's time. So just to sneakily get that in there anyway. So I thought you did a really, really good job. And I feel slightly uncomfortable in this role of giving feedback, because I know like a lot of the things I might say to you are things I need to tell myself as well. So my slides definitely don't look as good as yours, so I've got nothing to say about that. But more like one thing I think you might do, which is what I also do, is use presenter notes, which is a good thing, I think, sometimes. But it might also, especially if you've got a little time, it might sometimes make it like it's more tempting to then rely quite heavily on them, which I do too. And then it becomes sometimes like it sounds, and so I'm literally talking to myself because I do exactly the same thing. So just so you don't feel like I'm telling you off or anything, it can then maybe sound less natural. So it sounds maybe a little bit more rushed than it would do otherwise. So that was one thing I would say, and I need to do exactly the same. And I don't always have the confidence to not use them. So I think that's one thing I wanted to just point out, that and I need to do that equally. So I'm literally talking to myself to try to practice without using them and see whether maybe actually you are able to do that and it will sound slightly less rushed and maybe more natural. So that's just one like piece of feedback, but literally I am talking to myself. And then in terms of the content, one thing I wondered is whether you need, if you are mainly introducing the framework, whether you need to use the terms like establisher, installation, exploitation, because to someone who's not familiar with the specific paradigm you're using, they might not really know what that refers to. And because you weren't extensively relying on the audience having remembered that, you might not need to really like call them that, because they're just additional terms that have different meanings in different fields maybe as well. Like installation, I don't necessarily think about something related to theory of mind research. So I was just curious whether, like, yeah, you could, if you have a very short talk and you don't need to constantly refer back to those different phases of the paradigm, you might not need to use those terms and instead just keep it with a very generic sort of description of what it involves and kind of keep it intuitive. And then one final thing is that Zoom, if you're giving Zoom talks, Zoom is very good at filtering out noise if you're talking. So we couldn't hear what the noise was. I'm assuming it was a pet. I'm not sure. But
No,
so
it was like the
background
ambient
noise.
so loud.
Okay.
Yeah, I couldn't focus, sorry.
So we can't hear what that is. So it's usually fine to just assume that whatever is in the background, pets, like animals barking, babies crying, whatever, no one really hearing it. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. But I thought you did a really good job, and I'd love to hear a little bit about what you find and whether you do find differences. Also, like I was curious about the self-paced aspect of the task, like why you did that and what the benefit of that is.
Yes, so thank you so much for your feedback. Like, I do agree that sometimes I have prepared like a similar material for a longer presentation where I might have, referred to those terms, but it's true that maybe for this one, it wasn't as necessary. I guess I did want for people to actually understand well the stimuli, because that's literally like the focus of the whole project. In terms of the self-paced, we thought it was really interesting to have not only like eye tracking data. We in this particular project, we think not only about like triangulation of measures, but even more, like we just like correlating many different measures. So we're correlating comprehension measures with actual like behavioral measures that we take as proxy of how long they take to process the information they're seeing. And also with the eye tracking. So we were happy to also, to add like a behavioral measure as well. And another reason that we added it was that even though many people might think that it's really obvious to find differences in eye tracking when there's differences in comprehension, let's say, so two people think different things of a scene, they have different context, and we expect them to look at different places. That's not what they have been finding in the past, like not in theory of mind, but in general, like when comprehending scenes, what they find is a really high synchrony in gaze. People look at the same places no matter what when they're watching a film, because mainly one of the arguments they have given is movement of the images guides our attention a lot. So we wanted to see first whether we could find these differences if we sort of eliminated this movement in the images by just like showing them picture by picture. And we have found these differences. And now we're working in a project to validate these differences as well in motion. Because sort of, as I was trying to say in my last slide that I didn't have much time, the idea would be, can we actually just show patients a video and see whether just by looking at like subtle differences in their eye movements, can we actually be able to characterize them as already showing some symptoms, for example, as we were suggesting in this variant of frontotemporal dementia. So yeah, that's why we're using that.
That makes sense. That's really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on things that Karina said, because I think that'll be useful for everybody. I think this idea of going through your slides, and certainly when you're preparing for your job talk or a really big grant, that's basically what you do. You take a fine hair comb and you figure out, is that word absolutely essential, or is there an easier, more accessible one that I can use here? Similarly with the speaker notes, I find this really hard because when it's timed, and they're going to cut you off, or you'll be graded down if you go over time, what do you do? How do you find that balance between scripted, which means you stick to your time, versus flow, which has to sound totally cool and easy? I find this really, 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 really hard. Obviously practice makes perfect. So if you have a script, just learn it off by heart and figure out a way to make it not sound like you've learned it off by heart. But I still haven't found this trick. But I think that these two things are so key, especially for the format that we've had you guys use today for these 5-minute talks. It's a totally different kind of thing to a 45-minute, colloquium or, lab talk. This is something, it's an art form. And when you see really good ones, you're just like, wow, that is, that's magic. So
I think one of my worst flaws is that I struggle in like keeping focus on exactly what I want to say. And the moment I have some more freedom and I learn it even by heart, I will introduce more things. Like I know myself. That's why in this like super short formats, I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna, you know, stick to that. But it's true that if I've had a bit more time, definitely I would go and try to learn it.
Great talk, though. Just absolutely great talk.
Yeah. And I should probably add that this is social neuroscience. So if don't practice alone, show it to people. Don't be embarrassed. Everyone needs to do these things. I think if I show it to someone who's a colleague that I trust, then it'll be better than if I do it on my own. And maybe that's my take-home message for many things that I want to do myself. But whenever I open it to other people, it gets better. Okay, thank you so much, Cynthia.